Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli here for Bash U Basics, and I want to talk to you today about starting out and picking lures to start fishing with. It can be really intimidating. Part of the process to become an angler is selecting lures, selecting baits. There's so many, and this is going to be the first of a lot of parts on selecting the right baits for the right situation. But all of us at some point are going to start out with a tackle box that is empty. And I want to give you some of the most basic premise on how to fill this tackle box. And one of the biggest general rules of thumb I use for beginning bass anglers on what to select is use a theory that's called top to bottom. And basically in that theory, fish are always going to be in one of three zones in the water column. Fish are going to be relating near the surface of the water, from feeding on the top to maybe a foot down, and feeding up near the surface. Or a lot of times they're going to be in the middle of the water column. You hear the term suspended fish, fish that aren't on the top or aren't on the bottom, but are living in the middle and feeding on stuff that swims in the middle of the water column. And then finally in this theory, there's the bottom zone, and fish that live and feed near the bottom, relating directly to the bottom of the lake, river, pond, stream, right on the bottom. So I like to think about lure selection, bait selection, in terms of making sure you have those three zones covered. When you walk in that tackle store for the first time and you start to look at the thousands of choices, by breaking it down into those three categories, top, middle, and bottom, and picking lures that hit those three zones, it makes this lure selection process a lot easier and less intimidating. I'm going to walk with you now and just show you a couple of the real basic lure categories that fit into those three zones: top, middle, and bottom. And let's start on top and talk about a category of lure style called topwaters. And that is lures that stay on or near the surface of the water. And one of the very most basic ones we can buy are lures that float on the surface. A plastic frog, hollow-bodied floating frog, is a great surface lure that imitates a lot of stuff the fish feed on the surface, including frogs. Great example of a topwater lure. You know, the next one would be actual surface baits. And I want to show you two categories of surface lures. One being a walking stick bait style lure. The other one being a prop bait or popper. And all these lures, the frog, the walking bait, the popper and prop bait, all float on the surface and stay toward the top. So I've got my top zone covered for fish that are feeding on the surface. You know, the next category for me is a really important one, and that's the middle of the water column. As an example, if I'm fishing a lake that's 10 foot deep, I'm talking about fish that are living 3 to 7 foot down in that 5 to 6 foot zone in that 10 foot water column. Fish that are feeding in the middle. For that category, I've got a couple amazing choices to cover that zone. You know, the first one of my favorites for covering the middle zone is a crankbait. And the great thing about crankbait is a crankbait is a hard-bodied lure with a bill. And when you retrieve, that lure bill helps the lure dive down to that middle zone. This is a Rapala, and it's a great lure on getting into that middle zone. Another amazing one is a spinnerbait. And this is a sinking lure, but based on the speed at which we retrieve it, we can count it down to the middle of the water column and then retrieve it in such a way that it stays in the middle. And then one last one I have to show you for that middle zone is a really, really cool lure called a vibrating jig or chatterbait. And it's really phenomenal at working in the middle of the water column. Not at the top, not at the bottom, but straight through the middle. So make sure for your second lure choice, you're picking lures that stay in the middle of the water column. And then last but not least, I want to talk to you about the bottom zone and fishing lures that go to the bottom of the water column to activate fish that are feeding on the bottom. And a real clear natural choice for fishing near the bottom is, of course, soft plastics. And all of the different styles of soft plastic baits, including crawfish and worms and creature baits. But by rigging these lures on with weights and hooks or on jig heads, these lures sink directly to the bottom, and they do a great job of imitating natural forage that lives on the bottom. Things like crawfish and crabs and actual worms that live on the bottom. Amazing. So all your soft plastic shape, weighted the correct way, is a great way to fish on the bottom. And of course, one last one would be a jig, either a skirted jig or a jig head, again, threaded with your favorite plastic, is phenomenal for fishing down on the bottom. Listen, when you're first starting out and you're trying to fill your tackle box, don't get intimidated. Think about picking lures for the 3 different zones. Lures that stay on the top, like topwaters. Lures that cover the middle of the water column, like spinnerbaits, crankbaits, and vibrating jigs. And finally, lures that can be fished directly on the bottom for that bottom zone. Things like soft plastic worms and crawls and creature baits. And of course, skirted jigs. Keep it simple. Cover the 3 zones of the water column, and you're going to make your fishing really, really efficient, fun, and you're going to catch a lot of fish. Mike Iaconelli here for BU Basics.